The candle fell from Ellie Hartley's hand and rolled across the cold stone floor, still burning, throwing wild shadows on the wall. Above her, on the second floor, someone was screaming her name. "Ellie! Get up here now!" She grabbed the candle before it could catch the edge of the curtain, and ran up the narrow back stairs 2 at a time, her bare feet slapping against the wood. Her heart was pounding before she even reached the door. It was always like this in the Hartley house. A shout first, an explanation never. She pushed open the door to find her stepmother, Margaret Hartley, standing in the middle of the room with a torn letter in her hand, her face pale with fury. "Do you know what this is?" Margaret said, her voice shaking. Ellie shook her head, though she already sensed the danger. An invitation, from the palace. The Duke of Camden is holding a ball, and every household with a daughter of marrying age has been invited. Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Every unmarried woman in this house is invited. That includes you." Ellie's breath caught. For one bright second, hope rose in her chest, like a bird taking flight. Then Margaret laughed, a short, cruel sound. "You think you are going? Look at yourself. You smell like the ash pit. You have not owned a clean dress since your father died. Do you imagine the Duke of Camden would even glance at a girl like you?" "I wasn't thinking that," Ellie said quietly, though her voice trembled. "Good. Because you are not going." Margaret crumpled the letter further and threw it into the fire. "Charlotte and Beatrice will attend. You will help them prepare, and you will stay here, where you belong." Ellie opened her mouth to argue, but a sound from the doorway stopped her. Her 2 stepsisters, Charlotte and Beatrice, stood there, already smiling at the sight of her humiliation. "Don't look so sad, Ellie," Charlotte said, twirling a lock of her golden hair. "Someone has to keep the fire going while we're gone." "And feed the animals," Beatrice added. "And clean the mess from tonight's dinner. There's a great deal to do." Ellie said nothing. She had learned long ago that arguing only made things worse. 3 years had passed since her father, a respected trader named Edmund Hartley, had died suddenly of a fever that swept through the town. 3 years since Margaret had taken his fortune, his house, and his daughter's future, and buried them all under a mountain of false kindness that had long since worn away to reveal something much colder underneath. Ellie turned to leave the room, but Margaret's voice stopped her at the door. "Wait." Ellie turned back, bracing herself. "There is one more thing," Margaret said, walking toward a large wooden chest at the foot of her bed. She opened it and pulled out a dress, holding it up so the firelight caught its fabric. It was gray, torn at the hem, patched in 3 places, and stained with something dark near the collar. It looked like something a beggar might wear, not a young woman of a once-respected family. "You will wear this tomorrow morning when the carriage arrives," Margaret said. "Just for a moment, just so the neighbors can see you standing outside while your sisters leave for the ball in their fine gowns." Ellie stared at the dress, then at her stepmother's face, searching for any sign that this was a joke. There was none. "Why?" Ellie whispered. "Because it will remind you," Margaret said simply, "of exactly where you stand in this family. And it will remind the town that the Hartley name belongs to my daughters now, not to some forgotten girl who happens to share her father's blood." Charlotte giggled from the doorway. Beatrice did not even bother to hide her smile. Ellie took the dress with shaking hands because she had no choice, and walked back down to her small room beside the kitchen, the one that used to be a storage closet before Margaret decided it suited her better than any of the real bedrooms upstairs. She sat on the edge of her narrow cot and stared at the torn fabric in her lap. She thought of her father. She thought of the way he used to lift her onto his shoulders when she was small, the way his laugh used to fill the entire house, the way he called her his brightest light. She wondered, not for the first time, what he would think if he could see her now, wearing rags, in the very house he had built with his own hands. A knock came at her door, softer than she expected. She looked up to see the old housekeeper, Agnes Miller, standing in the doorway with a small bowl of soup. "You didn't eat," Agnes said gently, stepping inside and setting the bowl down beside her. "I wasn't hungry," Ellie lied. Agnes had worked in the Hartley house since before Ellie was born. She had known Ellie's mother, who had died giving birth to her, and she had loved Edmund Hartley like a brother. She was the only person left in the house who looked at Ellie with anything resembling warmth. Agnes's eyes fell on the torn dress lying across the cot. Her expression darkened. "What is this?" Margaret wants me to wear it tomorrow, when the carriage comes for Charlotte and Beatrice. Ellie's voice cracked slightly. She wants everyone to see. Agnes's jaw tightened, but she said nothing for a long moment. Then she reached out and squeezed Ellie's hand. "Listen to me," she said quietly. "Whatever happens tomorrow, whatever they make you wear, whatever they say in front of the neighbors, none of it changes who you are. You are Edmund Hartley's daughter. No dress can take that away from you." Ellie wanted to believe her, but 3 years of cruelty had worn a deep groove into her heart, one that made hope feel dangerous, like something that would only lead to more pain. "Go to sleep," Agnes said, standing. "Tomorrow will be difficult, but you will get through it. You always do." After Agnes left, Ellie lay awake for a long time, listening to the sounds of the house settling around her, the creak of the old wooden beams, the distant bark of a dog somewhere down the street. She thought about the ball, about the Duke of Camden, a man she had never met and likely never would. She had heard stories about him from the market women, how he had returned from the war in the eastern provinces 2 years ago, how he rarely smiled, how he had turned away every noble family that tried to arrange a marriage for him. Some said he was searching for someone specific. Others said he did not believe in love at all, only duty. None of it mattered to Ellie. Men like the Duke of Camden did not marry girls who scrubbed floors and smelled of ash. That was a truth as solid as the stone beneath her house, and she had accepted it long ago. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but sleep would not come easily. Somewhere deep inside her, beneath the exhaustion and the sorrow, a small ember of something else flickered. She did not dare call it hope, but it was there, stubborn and quiet, refusing to go out completely. Morning came too quickly. Ellie was woken by Beatrice pounding on her door, shouting that the carriage would arrive within the hour, and that she needed to help lace up their gowns. Ellie dressed quickly in her regular work clothes and rushed upstairs, where Charlotte and Beatrice stood in front of the tall mirror, admiring themselves in gowns of blue silk and deep rose satin. "Tighter," Charlotte snapped, as Ellie pulled the laces of her corset. "I want to look perfect tonight." "You already look beautiful," Ellie said honestly, because it was true. Whatever cruelty lived in Charlotte's heart, there was no denying the beauty of her face, or the elegance of the gown that had cost more than Ellie's family had spent on food in the last 6 months. "Of course I do," Charlotte said, though the compliment seemed to please her anyway. Downstairs, Margaret was already waiting by the front door, dressed in deep green, her hair pinned with pearl combs. She looked Ellie up and down with the same cold expression she always wore. "Go change," she said, "into the dress from last night." Ellie's stomach turned, but she walked back to her room and pulled the torn gray dress over her head. It hung loosely on her thin frame, the fabric scratching against her skin, the stain near the collar giving off a faint, unpleasant smell. She looked at herself in the small, cracked mirror on her wall and barely recognized the girl staring back. When she returned to the front hall, Charlotte and Beatrice burst into laughter. "Oh, this is perfect," Beatrice said, clapping her hands together. "You look exactly like a servant who wandered in from the street." "That is precisely the point," Margaret said, a satisfied smile crossing her face. "Now come outside. The carriage should be arriving any moment." Ellie followed them out onto the front steps, her bare feet cold against the stone. A small crowd had gathered along the street, neighbors who had come to see the Hartley daughters off to the royal ball, the biggest event the town had seen in a decade. Whispers rippled through the crowd the moment they saw Ellie standing there in her torn dress beside her elegantly dressed stepsisters. Ellie kept her eyes down, her cheeks burning with humiliation, but she could feel every stare, every whispered comment, every silent judgment being passed around her like a stone thrown from hand to hand. She thought about running back inside, but Margaret's grip suddenly closed around her wrist, holding her in place. "Smile," Margaret whispered through clenched teeth. "Let them see how well you've been cared for." The golden carriage arrived moments later, pulled by 2 white horses, its sides decorated with the royal crest. A footman stepped down and opened the door, and Charlotte and Beatrice climbed inside with practiced grace, waving to the crowd as though they were already royalty. Margaret turned back to Ellie one final time before stepping into the carriage herself. "Enjoy your evening," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "There is plenty of work waiting for you inside." The carriage door closed. The horses began to move, and Ellie stood alone on the front steps of her father's house, dressed in rags, watching the golden carriage disappear down the street, while the crowd slowly dispersed around her, their whispers trailing behind them like smoke. She did not cry. She had promised herself long ago that she would not give Margaret the satisfaction of her tears, not in front of the neighbors, not ever. Instead, she turned and walked back inside, closing the heavy front door behind her, and stood alone in the silence of the empty house. For a long moment, she simply stood there, staring at nothing, feeling the weight of the entire evening pressing down on her chest. Then, slowly, she became aware of a soft sound coming from the kitchen. Footsteps. Someone was still inside the house. Her heart quickened. She walked toward the kitchen, unsure of what she would find, and stopped in the doorway.
Agnes Miller was standing by the window, watching the empty street where the carriage had disappeared. She turned when she heard Ellie enter, and there was something different in her expression, something Ellie had not seen there in a very long time.
It looked, unmistakably, like determination. "Come here, child," Agnes said. "We don't have much time, and there is a great deal of work to do before tonight." Ellie blinked in confusion. "What do you mean?" Agnes smiled, and for the first time in 3 years, it was a smile that promised something other than sympathy. "I mean," she said, "that you are going to that ball tonight, and I am going to make certain the Duke of Camden never forgets your face." Ellie stared at Agnes, certain she had misheard. "The ball starts in a few hours. I have no gown, no carriage, and Margaret would return before midnight to find me gone. If she discovers this, she will." "She will not discover anything," Agnes interrupted, already moving toward the narrow door that led down to the cellar. "Not if we move quickly and quietly. Bring a candle." Ellie grabbed a candle from the kitchen shelf and followed Agnes down the creaking wooden stairs into the cellar, a place she rarely visited because it was cold and smelled of damp earth. Agnes walked past the shelves of preserved vegetables and old furniture, straight to a corner where a large trunk sat covered in a thick layer of dust. "This belonged to your mother," Agnes said, kneeling beside it. "Your father asked me to hide it the year Margaret moved in. He worried she might sell everything of value if she found it first." Ellie's breath caught. She had never known her mother, not truly, only through the stories Agnes and her father had told her over the years. To see something that had once belonged to her, hidden away for so long, felt like touching a piece of a life she had never been allowed to live. Agnes lifted the lid, and dust rose into the candlelight. Inside, carefully folded, lay a gown of deep blue silk, its color still rich despite the years it had spent hidden away. Beside it sat a pair of silver combs, a small string of pearls, and a pair of matching slippers. "It needs work," Agnes said, lifting the gown carefully and examining the seams. "The waist will need adjusting, and there is a small tear along the hem. But we have time, if we hurry." Ellie reached out and touched the fabric, her fingers trembling. "This is beautiful," she whispered. "Why would Margaret let something like this stay hidden for so long?" "Because she doesn't know it exists," Agnes said simply. "Your father was cleverer than people gave him credit for. He knew what kind of woman Margaret was long before he married her, though I believe he hoped, foolishly perhaps, that kindness might soften her over time. It never did, but he made certain that whatever remained of your mother's belongings would stay out of her reach, waiting for the day you might need them." Ellie felt tears building behind her eyes, but this time, they were not tears of sorrow. They carried something else entirely, something warm and aching at the same time. "We don't have long," Agnes said, standing and gathering the gown into her arms. "Come upstairs. I need better light, and you need to wash. You cannot walk into a royal ball smelling of the cellar." They moved quickly through the house, Agnes barking gentle instructions, as though she had done this 100 times before. Ellie washed in the kitchen basin, while Agnes prepared a needle and thread, examining the gown's seams by candlelight, muttering to herself about which adjustments needed to be made first. "Sit still," Agnes said, once Ellie had changed into the gown for the first time in years. She pinned the waist tighter, working with quick, practiced fingers. "Your mother was taller than you, but not by much. This will not take long to fix properly." As Agnes worked, Ellie found herself studying her own reflection in the small mirror propped against the kitchen wall. The gown, even unfinished, transformed her in a way she had not expected. The rags, the ash stains, the years of hidden humiliation, all seemed to fall away, if only for a moment, replaced by something that looked almost like the girl she might have become if her father had lived. There, Agnes said finally, stepping back to examine her work. It fits well enough. Now for your hair. Agnes worked quickly, brushing out Ellie's dark hair until it shone, then pinning it back with the silver combs, leaving a few soft curls to frame her face. She fastened the pearl necklace around Ellie's throat with careful hands. "Look at yourself," Agnes said softly. Ellie turned to the mirror and felt her breath catch in her throat. The girl staring back at her looked nothing like the servant who had stood on the front steps that morning, dressed in rags for the entire town to see. This girl looked graceful, composed, and, though Ellie hardly dared think the word, beautiful. "I don't know how to thank you," Ellie whispered. "Thank me by walking into that ballroom with your head held high," Agnes said. "Thank me by remembering exactly who you are, no matter what anyone in that house says to you afterward." A sudden knock at the front door made them both freeze. Ellie's heart leapt into her throat, certain for one terrible moment that Margaret had somehow returned early, that everything was about to be ruined before it had even begun. Agnes moved quickly to the window and peered out through the curtain. Relief washed over her face. "It's only Peter," she said, referring to the young stable boy who worked for the neighboring household. "Stay here." Agnes disappeared out the front door for a few minutes, and Ellie paced nervously in the kitchen, smoothing the fabric of her gown, terrified that something would go wrong before she even had the chance to leave the house. When Agnes returned, she was smiling. "Peter has agreed to drive you to the palace," she said. "His employer's carriage is not being used tonight, and he owes me a favor from many years ago. He will wait for a moment outside, but we must hurry. There is little time before the ball truly begins, and even less before your stepmother might return home for something she forgot." They rushed to finish the final preparations. Agnes wrapped a simple gray shawl around Ellie's shoulders to hide the gown from any curious eyes along the street, whispering that she should remove it once she reached the palace gates. She pressed a small coin purse into Ellie's hand, insisting she keep it hidden in case of emergency, though neither of them said aloud what kind of emergency she meant. "There is one more thing," Agnes said, as they stood by the front door. Her expression grew serious. "You must be back before midnight. Margaret and the girls will not stay past then, as the Duke's mother insists all formal balls end promptly at that hour out of tradition. If you are seen leaving after them, or if you return to find them already home, there will be no explanation that will save you from her anger." Ellie nodded, understanding the weight of the warning. "I will be back in time." "Good." Agnes squeezed her hands one final time. "Now go, before I change my mind and keep you here out of worry." Ellie stepped outside into the cool evening air, where a modest but clean carriage waited at the end of the street, driven by a young man with kind eyes who introduced himself simply as Peter. He helped her into the carriage with careful hands, as though sensing the importance of the night ahead, and within moments, they were moving through the darkened streets of the town, toward the distant glow of the palace lights. Ellie's hands trembled in her lap as the carriage rolled along the uneven road. She had never seen the palace up close before, only from a distance, its tall towers rising above the town like something out of a story told to children before bed. Now she was actually traveling toward it, dressed in her mother's gown, carrying a secret so large it made her chest tight with fear and excitement in equal measure. "Nervous?" Peter asked from the driver's seat, glancing back at her. "Terrified," Ellie admitted. "Don't be," he said. "Agnes told me a little of your story. Whatever happens tonight, you deserve one evening where you are not treated like something less than what you are." Ellie did not know how to respond to that, so she simply nodded and turned her attention back to the passing scenery. The town gave way to wider roads lined with tall trees, and slowly, the palace came into full view, its windows glowing with warm golden light, the faint sound of music drifting out into the night air. The closer they came, the more her nerves grew. She thought of Margaret's warning that morning, of Charlotte and Beatrice's cruel laughter, of the entire crowd of neighbors who had watched her stand in rags on the front steps just hours earlier. What if someone recognized her tonight? What if the gown was not enough to hide who she truly was beneath it? She pushed the thought away as firmly as she could. Agnes had risked a great deal to give her this chance. She would not waste it by hiding in fear before she had even walked through the palace doors. The carriage came to a stop at the edge of a long line of other carriages, all waiting to drop off their passengers at the base of the grand staircase leading up to the palace entrance. Ellie peered out the window at the scene before her. at the elegantly dressed guests climbing the stairs in pairs and groups, their laughter and conversation carrying on the night air, the palace guards standing at attention on either side of the entrance, in their formal uniforms. "This is as far as I can take you without drawing attention," Peter said, bringing the carriage to a full stop a short distance from the main entrance. "The walk from here is short. I will wait in this area until you return." Ellie took a deep breath and removed the gray shawl from her shoulders, folding it carefully and setting it aside on the carriage seat. Peter helped her down onto the stone path, and for a moment she simply stood there, staring up at the towering palace before her, its windows blazing with light, the sound of music growing louder with each passing second. "Thank you," she said to Peter, her voice barely above a whisper. "Go on," he said, offering her an encouraging smile. "The night is waiting for you." Ellie turned and began walking toward the palace entrance, her heart pounding with every step, the silk of her gown whispering softly against the stone path beneath her feet. She had no way of knowing, as she climbed the grand staircase toward the golden light and the sound of music spilling out into the night, that the evening ahead would change the entire course of her life. She only knew that for the first time in 3 long years, she was walking forward instead of standing still, and that alone felt like the beginning of something she had almost forgotten how to hope for. The palace doors were taller than any Ellie had ever seen, carved with images of vines and stars, and flanked by guards who barely glanced at her as she passed between them, swept along by the tide of arriving guests. Inside, the entrance hall opened into a space so grand it stole the breath from her lungs. Marble floors stretched out beneath a ceiling, painted with clouds and golden light, and a wide staircase curved upward on either side, leading toward the sound of music drifting from somewhere beyond. She had never stood in a room so vast, so beautiful, so far removed from the cramped little house she called home. For a moment, she simply stood still, letting the noise and color wash over her, feeling impossibly small and impossibly alive at the same time. "Your invitation, miss?" A palace attendant stood before her, dressed in deep red and gold, holding out a gloved hand expectantly. Ellie's stomach dropped. She had no invitation. In her rush to leave the house, neither she nor Agnes had considered how she would explain her presence without one. She began, searching desperately for something to say. "She's with the Ashcombe party," a voice said smoothly from beside her. Ellie turned, startled, to find a young woman about her own age standing there, dressed in pale yellow, smiling as though she and Ellie were old friends reuniting after a long absence. The attendant glanced between them, then nodded and stepped aside, allowing them both to pass. Once they were safely beyond the entrance, Ellie turned to the stranger, bewildered. "Thank you, but I don't understand. Why would you help me?" The young woman laughed softly. "Because I remember what it feels like to stand at a door like that, with no invitation, and no idea what to say. My name is Rosalind. I work for Lady Ashcombe, as a companion, which means I am permitted to bring one guest of my choosing tonight, and she rarely bothers to check who that guest actually is." She studied Ellie's face for a moment. "You look terrified. First royal ball? Is it that obvious?" Ellie asked, managing a small smile despite her nerves. "Only to someone who has felt exactly the same way," Rosalind said. "Come, walk with me. It is easier to appear as though you belong somewhere when you are not standing alone." Ellie gratefully accepted the offer, and the two of them made their way deeper into the palace, following the sound of music through a set of open double doors into the ballroom itself. The sight that greeted her was almost too much to take in all at once. Hundreds of candles burned in tall silver holders along the walls, their light reflecting off enormous mirrors and catching in the jewels of every guest in the room. An orchestra played from a raised platform at the far end of the hall, and couples moved together across the polished floor, in slow, graceful patterns, their gowns and coats forming a shifting sea of color beneath the glittering chandeliers above. "It's beautiful," Ellie breathed. "It is," Rosalind agreed. "Though I should warn you, beauty and kindness are not always found in the same place here. Half the guests in this room are more interested in climbing the social ladder than in enjoying the evening." Ellie scanned the crowd, her nerves returning as she remembered exactly why she needed to stay cautious. Somewhere in this enormous room, Margaret, Charlotte, and Beatrice were likely mingling among the other guests, and if any of them caught sight of her, the consequences would be severe. Is something wrong? Rosalind asked, noticing the change in her expression. I need to avoid a few people tonight, Ellie admitted carefully. My family. They don't know I'm here, and it would be very bad if they found out. Rosalind's eyebrows rose with curiosity, but she did not press further. Then we will simply have to keep you moving. Stay near the edges of the room where the crowds are thickest. It's much harder to be noticed there. They wove their way along the outer edge of the ballroom, past clusters of guests engaged in quiet conversation, past long tables laden with food Ellie had never even seen before, let alone tasted. She caught glimpses of Charlotte's golden hair near the dance floor at one point, and quickly turned in the opposite direction, her heart hammering until she was certain she had not been seen. There, Rosalind said suddenly, nodding toward the far end of the room. That is the reason half the young women here bothered to attend tonight at all. Ellie followed her gaze and saw him for the first time. The Duke of Camden stood near the raised dais at the head of the ballroom, dressed in deep navy and silver, taller than most of the men surrounding him, with dark hair swept back from a face that looked, even from this distance, tired, in a way that had nothing to do with the late hour. He was listening to an older nobleman speak, nodding occasionally, but his eyes kept drifting away from the conversation, scanning the room as though searching for something, or perhaps someone, though Ellie could not imagine what that might be. He looks unhappy, Ellie observed quietly. He always looks unhappy at these events, Rosalind said. Lady Ashcombe says he only agreed to host this ball because his mother insisted it was time he found a wife, and he is far too dutiful a son to refuse her outright. Every young woman here has spent the evening trying to catch his attention, and so far, not one of them has succeeded. As if to prove her point, Ellie watched as a young noblewoman in a stunning red gown approached the Duke, curtsying deeply and engaging him in conversation. He responded politely enough, but his expression remained distant, his answers brief, and within a few minutes the young woman withdrew, clearly disappointed. He doesn't want to be here, Ellie murmured. No, Rosalind agreed. But duty rarely asks what we want. They continued moving through the crowd, and Ellie found herself relaxing slightly, growing more comfortable with the rhythm of the evening, despite the constant undercurrent of fear that Margaret or her stepsisters might spot her at any moment. She sampled a small pastry from one of the long tables, watched the dancers move across the floor with an admiration she had never expected to feel, and allowed herself, just for a few minutes, to forget entirely about the life waiting for her back at home. It was during one of these quiet moments, standing near a tall window overlooking the palace gardens, that she noticed a commotion near the entrance to the ballroom. A group of guests had gathered around something, murmuring excitedly, and Ellie felt a flicker of unease as she strained to see what had caused the disturbance. What's happening? She asked Rosalind. Rosalind stood on her toes, trying to see over the crowd. It looks like the Duke's mother has arrived. She rarely attends these events in person, preferring to watch from her private chambers, so this must be important to her. Ellie watched as an elegant older woman, dressed in deep purple with silver hair pinned elaborately atop her head, made her way through the crowd toward her son. The Duke's expression shifted the moment he saw her, something like resignation crossing his features, before he composed himself and offered her a formal bow. The Duchess Dowager, Rosalind explained. She is the reason for tonight's entire event. Word is, she has grown tired of waiting for her son to remarry, and has decided to take matters into her own hands. Ellie watched the exchange between mother and son from a distance, noting the tension in the Duke's shoulders, the careful way he kept his expression neutral, while his mother spoke to him in low, urgent tones. Whatever she was saying, it clearly was not a casual greeting. After a few minutes, the Duchess Dowager turned and addressed the orchestra, raising a hand to signal for silence. The music slowly faded, and the murmur of conversation died down as every guest in the ballroom turned their attention toward the raised dais. Thank you all for joining us this evening, the Duchess Dowager announced, her voice carrying clearly across the enormous hall. As many of you already know, my son has returned from many long years of service to this kingdom, and it is time, past time in fact, that he consider his future beyond duty alone. A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the crowd, and Ellie noticed the Duke's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Tonight, the Duchess Dowager continued, he has agreed to something I have long hoped for. Before the evening ends, he will select one young woman with whom to share a private dance, a woman he believes shows true character, not merely a fine gown or a noble title. I encourage every guest here tonight to make an honest impression, for you never know who might catch his attention." The room erupted into excited whispers the moment she finished speaking. Ellie felt Rosalind grip her arm. "This changes everything," Rosalind whispered. "Every unmarried woman in this room is about to fight for his attention like never before." Ellie glanced toward the dance floor, watching as young women began adjusting their gowns, whispering strategies to their companions, positioning themselves more prominently near the areas the Duke was likely to pass. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly, the polite formality giving way to something sharper, more competitive. "I should stay out of the way," Ellie said quietly. "This isn't why I came tonight." "Why did you come tonight?" Rosalind asked, studying her curiously. Ellie hesitated, unsure how to answer honestly. She thought of Agnes's words, of the gown that had once belonged to her mother, of the quiet ember of hope that had refused to go out even after 3 years of cruelty. "I came because someone believed I deserved one evening, where I wasn't treated like I was worth nothing," Ellie finally said. "That's all. I don't need anything more than that." Rosalind's expression softened. "That may be the most honest answer I've heard all night." They continued moving along the edge of the room, though Ellie noticed the crowd growing thicker near the dance floor, as guests jostled for better positions. She kept her eyes carefully on the far side of the ballroom, avoiding the area where she had last seen Charlotte's golden hair, when a sudden collision nearly knocked her off balance. "I'm so sorry," a deep voice said immediately, a strong hand catching her elbow to steady her before she could stumble. Ellie looked up, and her breath caught entirely in her throat. She was standing face to face with the Duke of Camden himself. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Ellie's mind had gone completely blank, every polite phrase she had ever learned vanishing from her memory entirely. Up close, the Duke looked even more tired than he had from across the room, faint shadows beneath his dark eyes, though there was something else there too, a kind of quiet alertness that made her feel, strangely, as though he was truly seeing her, rather than simply looking through her the way most people did. "Forgive me," he said, releasing her elbow once he was certain she had regained her balance. "I wasn't watching where I was walking. Are you unharmed?" "I'm fine," Ellie managed to say, her voice steadier than she expected. "It was as much my fault as yours." "I wasn't paying attention either." He studied her for a moment, and Ellie became acutely aware of how out of place she must appear among the other guests, her gown fine enough but simple compared to the elaborate silks and jewels surrounding them. She braced herself for him to move on, to offer a polite excuse, and disappear back into the crowd of eager young women, waiting for his attention. Instead, he remained where he stood, his head tilting slightly, as though considering something. "You don't seem particularly interested in the announcement my mother just made," he observed. Ellie blinked, surprised by the directness of the comment. "Is it that obvious?" "Every other unmarried woman in this room is currently rearranging herself into the most flattering position possible," he said, a faint trace of dry humor entering his voice for the first time. "You, however, appear to be trying very hard to remain unnoticed. It's a rather unusual approach at an event specifically designed for the opposite purpose." Ellie felt heat rise in her cheeks, unsure whether she should be embarrassed or amused by his observation. "I suppose I came here for reasons that have very little to do with your mother's announcement." "And what reasons would those be?" She hesitated, weighing how much honesty was wise in this situation. But something about the way he asked, without the practiced charm she imagined most nobles used, made her decide the truth was safer than pretense. "I came because I was told I deserved one evening that felt different from every other evening in my life," she said simply. "That's the whole truth of it. I have no interest in dances arranged for the benefit of impressing anyone." He was quiet for a moment, studying her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "That may be the most refreshing thing anyone has said to me all evening." "I doubt that," Ellie said before she could stop herself. "Surely someone in this room has offered something more impressive than honesty." A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth, the first genuine expression she had seen cross his face since she'd first spotted him near the dais. "You would be surprised how rare honesty actually is in rooms like this one. Most conversations I have here revolve entirely around what people believe I want to hear." "And what do you want to hear?" Ellie asked, curiosity overtaking her nervousness. "I haven't decided yet," he admitted, though I suspect I would recognize it the moment I heard it. The orchestra began playing again somewhere behind them, a slower melody than before, and several couples moved toward the dance floor. The Duke glanced toward the sound briefly, before returning his attention to Ellie. "I don't believe I caught your name," he said. "Ellie," she said, then hesitated, uncertain whether to give her full name. If word reached Margaret that the Hartley name had been mentioned near the Duke, there would be no explaining her absence from home that night. Just Ellie, if that's acceptable. If he noticed her hesitation, he chose not to press the matter. "Just Ellie, then. I am Julian, though I suspect you already knew that." "The entire kingdom knows that," Ellie said, allowing herself a small smile. "Yes, unfortunately," he said, a trace of weariness returning to his voice. "Though very few people bother to ask what I might prefer to be called, or what I might actually think about anything beyond matters of state and marriage arrangements. What would you prefer to be called?" He seemed genuinely surprised by the question, as though no one had asked it of him in a very long time. "Julian is fine, actually. I only meant that people rarely address me as anything other than my title, as though the person underneath it has become somewhat irrelevant." Ellie considered this for a moment. "That sounds lonely." Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of surprise, perhaps even something closer to gratitude. "It is, actually. I don't believe anyone has said that to me so plainly before." They stood together near the tall window for a while longer, and Ellie found herself relaxing into the conversation, despite every instinct urging her to remain cautious, to avoid drawing too much attention, to remember that Margaret could appear at any moment. Julian asked about her interests, and she found herself speaking honestly about the small garden she used to tend before her father died, about the books she had read as a child, about the quiet moments she stole for herself whenever the household chores allowed it. In turn, he spoke about his years serving in the eastern provinces, though he kept the details vague, mentioning only that the experience had changed the way he viewed the world, had made the constant social performances expected of noble life feel increasingly hollow by comparison. "I imagine you've had your fill of noble life expecting things of you," Ellie said. "More than my fill," he agreed, "which is precisely why this conversation has been the most enjoyable part of my entire evening. You haven't once asked about my title, my land holdings, or my mother's opinion of potential brides." "Should I have?" Ellie asked, feigning innocence. "Absolutely not," he said, and this time his smile reached his eyes fully. "Please continue exactly as you have been." A sudden burst of laughter from across the ballroom drew Ellie's attention, and her stomach dropped instantly when she recognized the sound. Charlotte's laugh, unmistakable even from a distance, carried across the crowded room, and Ellie instinctively stepped slightly behind Julian, using his taller frame to block herself from view. "Is something wrong?" Julian asked, noticing the sudden change in her posture. "I need to be careful about who sees me tonight," Ellie admitted quietly, unable to fully explain the situation without revealing far more than she was ready to share. Julian studied her for a moment, and to her relief, he did not press for details. Instead, he simply extended his arm slightly, angling his body in a way that would obscure her more completely from the direction of the laughter. "Then let's move somewhere quieter," he said. "There is a smaller gathering room just beyond the main hall, far less crowded, if you're willing." Ellie hesitated only briefly before nodding, grateful for the offer. They moved together through a side door near the tall windows, leaving the noise and crowd of the main ballroom behind them, entering a smaller room decorated with soft candlelight and comfortable seating, occupied by only a handful of guests engaged in quiet conversation near the far wall. "Better?" Julian asked. "Much better," Ellie admitted, feeling some of the tension leave her shoulders. "Thank you." They found a quiet corner near a set of glass doors that opened onto a small balcony overlooking the palace gardens below. The night air drifted in through the open doors, cool and fragrant with the scent of blooming flowers, a welcome contrast to the warmth and noise of the main ballroom. "You still haven't told me why you need to avoid being seen tonight," Julian said gently, leaning against the balcony railing as Ellie joined him. She considered how much to reveal, weighing the risk against the strange comfort she felt in his presence, a comfort she had not expected to find in anyone, let alone a stranger she had only just met. "My family situation is complicated," she said carefully. "There are people here tonight who would be very unhappy to know I attended, and the consequences for me would be significant if they discovered it. That sounds like more than simple family disagreement, Julian observed, his voice gentle but perceptive. Ellie looked out over the darkened garden, considering how much truth she was willing to share with a man she had known for less than an hour. A man whose title alone placed him in a world so far removed from her own reality that the distance felt almost impossible to measure. My father passed away several years ago, she said finally. Since then, my situation at home has changed considerably. Tonight is the first time in a very long while that anyone has treated me as though I mattered. Julian was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the soft light spilling from the room behind them. I'm sorry for your loss, he said, and I'm sorry that anyone in your life has made you feel as though you don't matter. From everything I've seen this evening, that could not be further from the truth. Ellie felt an unexpected warmth spread through her chest at his words, a warmth she hadn't realized she'd been missing until this very moment. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, a voice called out from the doorway behind them. Your Grace, your mother is asking for you. Julian sighed quietly, straightening from where he'd been leaning against the railing. Duty calls, it seems, even in the middle of the most interesting conversation I've had in years. You should go, Ellie said, though something in her chest tightened at the thought of the evening ending so quickly. I don't want to, Julian admitted, surprising her with his honesty. But I imagine you understand better than most what it means to have very little choice in certain matters. Ellie nodded, understanding completely. Will you still be here later this evening? He asked, his tone carrying something that sounded almost like hope, though Ellie couldn't quite believe that a man like him would hope for anything involving someone like her. I have to leave before midnight, she said, but until then, yes, I'll be here. Then I intend to find you again, before this night ends, Julian said, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. Please don't disappear on me, just Ellie. Before she could respond, he turned and disappeared through the doorway, leaving her alone on the balcony, with the cool night air and the distant sound of music drifting from the ballroom beyond. She pressed a hand to her chest, feeling her heart racing beneath her fingers, and wondered, for the first time all evening, whether the ember of hope she had carried for so long might finally be allowed to grow into something more. She had no way of knowing that somewhere inside the palace, Margaret had just noticed a familiar gown moving through the crowd, and that recognition was already beginning to spread like fire through dry grass. Margaret Hartley stood near the refreshment table, a glass of wine in her hand, half listening to a conversation with a neighboring landowner's wife, when something caught the corner of her eye. A flash of deep blue silk, disappearing through a side door near the tall windows. She turned her head fully, but the crowd had already shifted, swallowing whatever she thought she'd seen. She told herself it was nothing. Half the women in this room wore blue tonight. It was a common enough color for a formal event. And yet something about the particular shade, the particular way the fabric had caught the candlelight, tugged at a memory she couldn't quite place. Is something wrong, Margaret? The landowner's wife asked, noticing her distracted expression. No, nothing at all, Margaret said, forcing a smile back onto her face. I thought I recognized someone, that's all. She excused herself a few minutes later and made her way through the crowd, scanning faces as she walked, searching for the flash of blue that had caught her attention. She found Charlotte first, standing near the dance floor with a group of young noblewomen, fanning herself and complaining loudly about the heat. Have either of you seen anything unusual tonight? Margaret asked, keeping her voice casual. Unusual how? Beatrice asked, appearing at her mother's side with a plate of small pastries. Never mind, Margaret said, deciding not to alarm her daughters over what was likely nothing more than her own imagination. Enjoy yourselves. I'm going to speak with Lady Pemberton. But the uneasy feeling refused to leave her as she moved through the crowd, and when she finally caught a proper glimpse of the woman in blue silk standing beside the Duke near the tall windows, her entire body went cold. It couldn't be. It was simply not possible. She pushed closer through the crowd, her heart pounding with a mixture of disbelief and rising fury, but by the time she reached the spot where she'd seen them, the Duke had already been called away, and the young woman in blue had vanished through a side door leading to a smaller room beyond the main hall. Margaret stood frozen for a long moment, replaying the brief glimpse in her mind. The dark hair, the particular tilt of the chin, the gown, which now that she thought about it more carefully, bore an unsettling resemblance to something she vaguely remembered from years ago, something that had belonged to Edmund's first wife, tucked away somewhere in the house, and long since forgotten. "It cannot be her," Margaret muttered under her breath. "It simply cannot be." And yet the doubt gnawed at her, sharp and insistent, refusing to be dismissed, no matter how impossible the idea seemed. She made her way toward the side door, pushing past several guests without apology, determined to see for herself whether her eyes had truly deceived her. Inside the smaller gathering room, Ellie stood near the balcony doors, still catching her breath from her conversation with Julian, her mind replaying every word he had spoken, every look that had passed between them. She had no idea that danger was approaching until she heard a voice from the doorway that made her blood run cold. "Ellie?" She turned, and her heart nearly stopped entirely. Margaret stood in the doorway, her face pale with shock, her eyes moving slowly from Ellie's face, down to the blue silk gown, taking in every detail with growing horror. "It is you," Margaret said, her voice trembling with disbelief. "How dare you? How dare you sneak into this palace, wearing—" She stopped, her eyes narrowing further as recognition finally clicked into place. "That gown. That is her gown. That belonged to your mother." Ellie's mind raced, searching desperately for some way out of the situation, but there was nowhere to run. No explanation that would satisfy the fury building visibly in Margaret's expression. "You will remove that dress and leave this palace immediately," Margaret hissed, stepping further into the room, keeping her voice low enough not to draw the attention of the other guests scattered throughout the space. "Do you have any idea what you've done? If anyone discovers who you truly are, the humiliation will follow this family for years." "I've done nothing wrong," Ellie said, forcing steadiness into her voice despite the fear pounding through her chest. "I was invited to this ball the same as everyone else in this household. You simply chose to forbid it." "I chose correctly," Margaret snapped. "Look at yourself, parading around in a dead woman's gown, speaking with the Duke as though you belong in rooms like this one. You embarrass yourself, and you embarrass this family. This family stopped feeling like mine the day you decided I belonged in the kitchen instead of at the table," Ellie said, surprising herself with the sharpness in her own voice. Margaret's face flushed with anger. "You ungrateful girl! After everything I have done for you, keeping a roof over your head, feeding you, allowing you to remain in this family despite having no true claim to it any longer." "I have every claim to it," Ellie interrupted, her voice rising slightly despite her attempts to remain calm. "I am my father's daughter. That claim did not disappear the day he died, no matter how badly you wished it had." For a moment, Margaret looked as though she might strike her hand twitching at her side, but the presence of other guests in the room seemed to hold her back. Instead, she stepped closer, lowering her voice to a venomous whisper. "You will leave this palace right now, and you will never speak of tonight again. If you refuse, I promise you, the consequences waiting for you at home will be far worse than anything you can imagine. And do not think for one moment that the Duke's interest in you means anything at all. Men like him entertain themselves with girls like you for one evening and forget your name by morning." The words struck harder than Ellie wanted to admit, planting a seed of doubt she desperately tried to push away. But before she could respond, a new voice entered the conversation, calm but carrying an unmistakable authority that made Margaret freeze instantly. "I don't believe I caught your name." Both women turned to find Julian standing in the doorway, having returned from his conversation with his mother sooner than either of them expected. His expression was carefully neutral, but there was something sharp in his eyes as he looked between Ellie's pale face and Margaret's furious one. "Your Grace," Margaret said, her entire demeanor shifting instantly into practiced politeness, though Ellie could see the panic flickering beneath the surface. "Forgive the disturbance. This is merely a private family matter, nothing that need concern you. It concerns me a great deal when I return to find a guest of mine looking as though she has been threatened," Julian said, his voice remaining calm, but carrying an edge that left no room for argument. Margaret's composure faltered slightly. "I assure you, Your Grace, there has been some misunderstanding. This young woman is my late husband's daughter, and she attended tonight without proper permission. I was simply explaining that it would be best for her to return home." "Is that true?" Julian asked, turning his attention to Ellie. Ellie hesitated, aware that whatever she said next would carry consequences far beyond this single moment. But she had spent 3 years swallowing her voice, accepting whatever version of events Margaret decided to tell, and something inside her refused to do it any longer. Not here. Not in front of this man who had looked at her, for the first time in years, as though she actually mattered. "It's true that I came here without permission," Ellie said carefully, "but not because I did anything wrong. My stepmother forbade me from attending, because she did not believe someone in my position deserved to be here." "Your position?" Julian repeated, his gaze sharpening with interest. "After my father died, my stepmother took control of the household," Ellie explained, her voice growing steadier with each word. "I have spent the last 3 years working as a servant in what was once my father's home, forbidden from the life I was born into, treated as though I no longer have any claim to my own family." Margaret's face had gone pale with fury and panic in equal measure. "That is a gross exaggeration of the truth, Your Grace. She has always been cared for, given shelter and food, despite being a considerable burden on this family's resources." "A burden," Ellie repeated quietly, the words landing like a physical blow, despite having heard variations of them countless times before. Julian's expression had grown noticeably colder as he listened, his eyes moving between the two women, with an intensity that made even Margaret visibly shrink back slightly. "I have heard enough," he said finally. "Whatever arrangement exists within your household, madam, is not something I intend to involve myself in tonight. However, I will say this clearly. This young woman was invited to this palace, the same as every other guest in attendance, and she will remain here for as long as she wishes, under my protection if necessary." Margaret opened her mouth to argue, but Julian's expression left no room for further discussion. "I suggest you return to the main ballroom," he continued, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of his position. "I have no further interest in continuing this conversation." For a long moment, Margaret stood frozen, caught between fury and the undeniable reality that she held no power in this particular room, not against a man whose word carried weight throughout the entire kingdom. Finally, with a stiff, shallow curtsy, she turned and left the room without another word, though the look she cast back at Ellie promised that this confrontation was far from finished. Once she was gone, Julian turned back to Ellie, his expression softening considerably. "Are you all right?" Ellie let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, her hands trembling slightly at her sides. "I think so. Thank you for that. You didn't have to intervene." "I wanted to," Julian said simply. "No one should be spoken to the way she was speaking to you, regardless of whatever family arrangement exists between you." "She's right about one thing, though," Ellie said quietly, unable to keep the doubt entirely out of her voice. "I don't belong here. Not truly. This life, this palace, none of it was ever meant for someone like me." "I disagree entirely," Julian said, stepping closer. "In the short time I've known you tonight, you have shown more honesty, more genuine character than anyone else I've encountered in this palace in years. If that doesn't belong here, then perhaps the problem lies with this palace, not with you." Ellie felt her throat tighten with emotion she hadn't expected, 3 years of doubt and humiliation pressing against the words Julian had just spoken, refusing to be so easily dismissed despite how badly she wanted to believe him. "You barely know me," she said softly. "Then let me know you better," Julian said, his voice gentle but earnest. "Stay. Dance with me. Let the rest of this evening speak for itself." Ellie looked toward the doorway where Margaret had disappeared moments before, fear and uncertainty still churning in her stomach at the thought of what consequences might await her when she finally returned home. But then she looked back at Julian, at the sincerity in his expression, at the quiet strength of his presence beside her, and she felt something shift within her chest, something that had been buried for far too long beneath fear and obligation. "All right," she said finally, a small smile breaking through despite everything. "One dance." Julian's answering smile was warmer than anything she had seen from him all evening, and he offered his arm, leading her back toward the main ballroom, toward the music and the light and the countless eyes that would surely turn toward them the moment they stepped through the door. Ellie had no way of knowing that Margaret was already moving through the crowd toward Charlotte and Beatrice, her mind working quickly through every possible way to salvage the situation before the entire kingdom learned the truth about the girl in blue silk dancing with the Duke of Camden. The moment they stepped back into the main ballroom, heads began to turn. Ellie felt the weight of dozens of curious stares settling on her, whispers rippling outward from the doorway like ripples across still water. She kept her chin lifted, remembering Agnes's words from earlier that evening, refusing to let the attention shake the fragile confidence she had only just begun to find. Julian led her toward the center of the dance floor as the orchestra shifted into a new melody, slower and more deliberate than the lively tunes that had filled the earlier hours of the evening. He turned to face her, one hand resting lightly at her waist, the other clasping hers with a gentleness that surprised her. "I should warn you," he said quietly, as the music began to swell around them. "The moment we begin this dance, every person in this room will assume it means something significant, doesn't it?" Ellie asked, unable to keep a small, nervous smile from tugging at her lips. "I suppose it does," Julian admitted, and for the first time all evening, she saw something that looked almost like vulnerability cross his features. "I haven't danced with anyone at one of these events in over 2 years. My mother has commented on it more than once." "Then I imagine we're about to give her quite a lot to comment on," Ellie said. They began to move together across the floor, and despite her limited experience with formal dancing, Ellie found the steps came more naturally than she expected, guided by the steady confidence of Julian's lead. The rest of the room seemed to fall away as they moved, the music wrapping around them, the watching eyes of the crowd fading into the background until it felt, for a few precious minutes, as though they were the only 2 people in the entire palace. "Tell me something true," Julian said quietly, as they turned slowly across the polished floor. "About what?" "Anything. Something no one else in this room knows about you." Ellie considered the request carefully, aware of how rarely anyone had asked her something so simple, so genuine. "I used to sing to my mother's garden," she said finally. "Before my father died, before everything changed, there was a small patch of flowers behind our house that I tended every morning, and I would sing to them while I worked, silly little songs I made up myself. I haven't sung anything in years." "Why not?" "Because the version of me who sang to gardens disappeared a long time ago," Ellie said softly, "replaced by someone who scrubs floors and mends torn dresses, and tries very hard not to remember what it felt like to be happy." Julian's expression grew serious, his hand tightening slightly around hers. "That version of you isn't gone," he said. "I've seen glimpses of her all evening, in the way you speak, in the way your eyes light up when you talk about things you care about. She's still there, Ellie. She simply needs a reason to come back fully." Before Ellie could respond, a commotion near the edge of the dance floor drew both their attention. Margaret had returned, flanked by Charlotte and Beatrice, and she was speaking loudly enough that several nearby guests had already turned to listen, their expressions shifting from curiosity to scandalized fascination. "That girl is no one of importance," Margaret was saying, her voice carrying deliberately across the space. "She is a servant in my household, nothing more. It is an embarrassment that she has been allowed to remain at this event, dressed in stolen clothing, deceiving your grace and everyone else in this room." The music faltered slightly as more guests turned to watch the unfolding scene, and Ellie felt her stomach drop as every eye in the ballroom seemed to fix on her at once. Julian's grip on her hand remained steady, but she could feel the tension building in his posture as Margaret continued speaking. "I demand that she be removed immediately," Margaret continued, emboldened by the growing attention. "It is not appropriate for a common servant to be parading around this palace as though she belongs among noble company." Whispers erupted throughout the ballroom, and Ellie felt her face burning with humiliation as dozens of unfamiliar eyes studied her, some with curiosity, others with open disdain. She wanted desperately to disappear, to sink into the polished floor and vanish entirely, rather than face the judgment of an entire room full of strangers. "That is quite an accusation," Julian said, his voice cutting cleanly through the murmuring crowd, calm, but carrying an authority that instantly silenced the whispers around them. "Perhaps you would care to explain what exactly you believe this young woman has stolen." "The gown," Margaret said, pointing accusingly. "It belonged to her late mother, kept hidden in our household for years. She took it without permission, and used it to sneak into an event she had no right to attend." "A gown that belonged to her own mother," Julian repeated slowly, "which she wore to attend an event, to which she was formally invited, as a member of your household. I fail to see the crime in that." Margaret's confidence faltered slightly, but she pressed forward regardless. "She is not truly a member of noble society any longer, Your Grace. Her father's fortune was lost long ago. She works as a servant in my home now, nothing more." "And whose decision was that?" Julian asked, his tone growing sharper. The question hung in the air, and Margaret hesitated, clearly recognizing the trap forming around her own words. Around them, the crowd had grown noticeably quieter, sensing that something significant was unfolding before them. "I have provided for her out of the kindness of my own heart," Margaret said finally, though her voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. "Kindness," Julian repeated, his eyes moving toward Ellie briefly, before returning to Margaret, with an intensity that made her visibly flinch. "I have heard a very different account of the kindness shown to this young woman tonight. I understand she was dressed in torn, soiled clothing this very morning, and forced to stand outside her own home while the neighbors watched, purely for the amusement of her stepfamily." A collective gasp moved through the surrounding guests, and Ellie felt her cheeks flush deeper as the humiliating memory was spoken aloud in front of so many strangers. Margaret's face had gone pale, her earlier confidence crumbling rapidly beneath the weight of the growing attention. "That is a private family matter," Margaret said weakly, "not something that concerns your grace or anyone else in this room." "It concerns me very much," Julian said, "when I discover that a guest in my own home tonight has spent the last 3 years enduring treatment no member of any family, noble or common, should ever be subjected to." The Duchess Dowager had made her way through the crowd during the exchange, drawn by the commotion, and now stood at the edge of the gathering, watching the scene unfold with sharp, assessing eyes. Julian glanced toward his mother briefly before continuing. "I believe," he said, addressing Margaret directly, "that an investigation into the handling of Edmund Hartley's estate would reveal a great deal about how his fortune was truly managed following his death. I intend to request exactly that, beginning tomorrow morning." Margaret's face drained of all remaining color. "Your Grace, surely that isn't necessary. This has all been a simple misunderstanding, nothing more." "Then you have nothing to fear from an investigation," Julian said evenly. "If everything has been handled properly, the results will confirm precisely that." Charlotte and Beatrice exchanged panicked glances behind their mother, and Ellie watched as the confident, cruel expressions they had worn throughout the evening crumbled into something far more uncertain. For the first time in 3 long years, Ellie felt the balance of power in the room shift entirely away from the family that had spent so long making her feel small. "This girl," Margaret tried one final time, gesturing toward Ellie with a trembling hand, "is nothing more than a servant, unfit for the company of nobility, unfit for the attention of someone of your standing, your Grace. Surely you can see that." Julian turned fully toward Ellie then, releasing Margaret from his attention entirely, and something in his expression shifted into something warmer, something that made Ellie's heart stumble in her chest. "I see a young woman," he said, loud enough for the entire crowd to hear clearly, "who has endured more hardship in 3 years than most people in this room have faced in a lifetime, and who has done so with more grace and honesty than anyone I have encountered since returning from the war. I see someone entirely deserving of respect, admiration, and far more kindness than she has been shown." A hush fell across the ballroom, broken only by the soft crackle of candlelight and the faint rustle of silk gowns, as guests leaned closer, straining to hear every word. "Whatever this family believes her worth to be," Julian continued, his eyes never leaving Ellie's face, "I have come to a very different conclusion tonight." Ellie's breath caught entirely in her throat, the weight of his words settling over her like something warm and impossibly overwhelming. Around them, the crowd waited in tense silence, sensing that something momentous was unfolding before their eyes, something none of them had expected when the evening began. Julian reached for Ellie's hand once more, holding it gently but firmly, his gaze steady and sincere despite the hundreds of watching eyes surrounding them. "Ellie Hartley," he said clearly, "I would like the entire kingdom to know exactly how much I value what I have found in you tonight." A murmur of astonishment rippled through the crowd as the meaning behind Julian's words settled over the room. Ellie stood frozen, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain everyone around her could hear it, unable to fully process what she had just heard. "Your Grace," Margaret began, her voice shaking with a mixture of disbelief and rising panic. "Surely you cannot mean—" "I mean precisely what I said," Julian interrupted, his eyes never leaving Ellie's face. "I am aware this is unconventional. I am aware my mother had a very different sort of announcement in mind for this evening. But I have spent 2 years since returning from the war, attending events exactly like this one, meeting countless young women whose only interest lies in my title and my land. And tonight, for the first time, I met someone who spoke to me as though I was simply a person, nothing more and nothing less. Ellie's throat had tightened so completely she could barely find her voice. "Julian, You don't have to answer tonight," he said gently, sensing her overwhelming uncertainty. "I only wanted every person in this room, including your stepmother, to understand exactly how I view you, regardless of whatever they have told you to believe about your own worth." The Duchess Dowager stepped forward from the crowd then, her expression unreadable as she studied the scene before her. Ellie braced herself for disapproval, certain that a woman of such standing would never accept a servant girl into her family, regardless of her son's feelings. "Young woman," the Duchess Dowager said, addressing Ellie directly, her voice carrying a weight of authority that silenced the remaining whispers throughout the ballroom. "Is it true, what my son has described, that you have been treated as a servant within your own father's household these past years?" "Yes," Ellie said, finding her voice at last, though it trembled slightly. "It's true. And this gown," the Duchess Dowager continued, gesturing toward the deep blue silk, "belonged to your late mother." "Yes," Ellie confirmed. "It was hidden away by our housekeeper, who helped me prepare for tonight without my stepmother's knowledge." The Duchess Dowager studied her for a long moment, her sharp eyes moving over Ellie's face, with an intensity that made her feel as though every secret she carried was being carefully examined and weighed. "I have watched my son turn away dozens of young women these past 2 years," the Duchess Dowager finally said, turning to address the wider crowd as much as Ellie herself. "Women of considerable wealth, impeccable breeding, and calculated charm, all of whom failed to capture even a moment of his genuine attention. Tonight, within the span of a few short hours, I have watched him speak more openly, more warmly, than I have witnessed in years." She paused, her expression softening slightly. "I do not believe that response emerges from nothing. Character reveals itself in moments like these, regardless of the gown one wears, or the household one comes from." A wave of relief so powerful, it nearly buckled her knees, washed over Ellie at the Duchess Dowager's words, though the moment was quickly interrupted by Margaret's desperate voice, cutting through the crowd once more. "This is absurd," Margaret said, her composure entirely gone now, replaced by something closer to genuine fear. "She has nothing. No dowry, no proper family name remaining, no connections of any value. This marriage would bring shame upon the crown itself." "The only shame I see here," the Duchess Dowager said coldly, turning her full attention toward Margaret, "belongs to a woman who mistreated her late husband's daughter for personal gain, then attempted to publicly humiliate her in front of the entire kingdom rather than face the consequences of her own actions. I suggest you consider very carefully how you wish to proceed from this point forward, given that my son has already indicated an investigation into your management of the Hartley estate will begin tomorrow morning." Margaret's face had gone completely white, and beside her, Charlotte and Beatrice looked as though they wished the polished marble floor might simply open and swallow them whole. Without another word, Margaret grabbed her daughters by their wrists and began pulling them toward the exit, her earlier confidence entirely dissolved into desperate retreat. As they disappeared through the crowd, a distant clock somewhere within the palace began to chime, each note ringing out clearly across the sudden hush that had fallen over the ballroom. Ellie's stomach dropped as she counted the chimes, realizing with rising horror exactly what time it had become. "Midnight," she whispered, panic flooding through her. "I have to go. I promised Agnes I would return before Margaret and the girls." "Ellie, wait," Julian said, reaching for her hand as she turned to leave. "I can't stay," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "You don't understand. If Margaret arrives home before I do, if she has any time alone with Agnes before I return." She didn't finish the thought, but the fear in her expression conveyed enough. Julian's grip on her hand tightened, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Then let me take you home myself," he said firmly. "My carriage is faster than anything else waiting outside these gates. We can be there long before Margaret's household arrives." Ellie hesitated only a moment before nodding, grateful beyond words for his understanding. Julian turned quickly to a nearby attendant, issuing rapid instructions, and within minutes they were rushing through the palace corridors together, leaving behind the stunned silence of the ballroom and the whispered conversations that would undoubtedly continue long after they had gone. Outside, a sleek black carriage, bearing the royal crest, waited at the base of the grand staircase, and Julian helped Ellie inside before climbing in beside her, calling instructions up to the driver as the horses lurched into motion. "Thank you," Ellie said breathlessly, still trying to process everything that had happened in the span of a single evening. "For all of it. For defending me. For what you said in front of everyone. For this." "I meant every word," Julian said, his expression serious in the dim light of the carriage interior. "I understand this has been an overwhelming night, and I don't expect an answer to what I said back there. Not yet. But I want you to know that my feelings were not born from some passing fascination. Whatever happens after tonight, I intend to see this through properly, with your family's situation investigated fairly and your future secured, regardless of what you ultimately decide about a future with me." Ellie stared at him, marveling at the sincerity in his voice, so different from anything she had experienced in the 3 long years since her father's death. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why does any of this matter so much to you? You barely know me." "Because for 2 years," Julian said quietly, "I have watched people perform kindness, perform interest, perform every emotion they believe I want to see, all in pursuit of what my title might offer them. Tonight, you offered me nothing but honesty, even when it clearly frightened you to do so. That kind of courage is rare, Ellie. Rarer than any fortune or title could ever be." The carriage rattled through the darkened streets, and Ellie found herself watching the passing buildings with a strange sense of unreality, as though the events of the evening belonged to someone else's life entirely, some story she had merely been allowed to witness rather than live through herself. As they approached the familiar street where the Hartley house stood, Ellie's nerves returned in full force. She had no idea what awaited her once she stepped through that door, no way of knowing whether Margaret and her stepsisters had somehow managed to arrive first, no certainty about what consequences might follow the very public confrontation that had just taken place at the palace. "Whatever happens tonight," Julian said, seeming to sense her rising anxiety, "you are no longer facing it alone. I intend to call upon your household formally, tomorrow morning, with proper authority behind me, to ensure your situation is addressed once and for all." The carriage rolled to a stop outside the modest house, and Ellie could see no other carriage waiting there, no sign that Margaret had somehow beaten them home. Relief flooded through her, quickly followed by a fresh wave of nervous uncertainty about everything that lay ahead. "Thank you," she said again, turning to face him one final time before stepping down from the carriage. "For tonight, for everything." "This isn't goodbye," Julian said, taking her hand gently and pressing a soft kiss against her knuckles. "This is simply the beginning, Ellie Hartley. I intend to prove that tonight." Ellie stepped down from the carriage and watched it disappear back into the darkness, her heart pounding, with a strange mixture of exhaustion, fear, and something that felt remarkably like hope, an emotion she had almost forgotten how to recognize after 3 long years of learning to expect nothing from the world at all. She hurried inside, quickly changing out of the borrowed gown and back into her simple nightclothes before Agnes could even finish asking about the evening's events. But as she recounted everything that had happened, the humiliation, the confrontation, the astonishing proposal spoken in front of an entire ballroom of witnesses, she saw tears gather in the old housekeeper's eyes, tears that spoke of decades of hoping for exactly this kind of justice. Neither of them could have known, as they sat together in the quiet kitchen long after midnight, that the following morning would bring changes to the Hartley household far beyond anything either of them had dared to imagine. Margaret returned home just before 1 in the morning, storming through the front door with Charlotte and Beatrice trailing behind her, both girls unusually silent after the public disaster that had unfolded at the ball. Ellie heard the commotion from her small room beside the kitchen and braced herself for whatever confrontation might follow, but to her surprise, Margaret did not come looking for her. Instead, she heard hushed, frantic voices moving between the upstairs rooms late into the night, the sound of drawers being opened and closed, of papers being shuffled and hidden away. Agnes appeared at Ellie's door not long after, her expression grim. "She's trying to hide something," the housekeeper whispered. "I heard her mention documents, ledgers, something about the estate records. Whatever she's done with your father's fortune these past years, she knows the truth is about to come to light." Ellie barely slept that night, her mind racing between exhaustion and anxious anticipation, replaying every moment of the evening over and over, until the events began to feel almost like a dream she had conjured out of desperation, rather than something that had truly happened. But the ache in her feet from dancing, and the faint scent of the palace gardens still clinging to her hair, reminded her that none of it had been imagined. Morning arrived with a knock at the front door so formal and authoritative that even Margaret, still in her dressing gown, rushed to answer it herself. Ellie watched from the kitchen doorway as a royal messenger stood on the front steps, flanked by 2 palace guards, holding an official document bearing the royal seal. "Margaret Hartley," the messenger announced. "By order of His Grace the Duke of Camden, and with the authority of the Crown, a formal investigation into the management of the late Edmund Hartley's estate has been ordered, effective immediately. All financial records pertaining to this household are to be surrendered for review within the week." Margaret's face drained of color as she accepted the document with trembling hands. Behind her, Charlotte and Beatrice had gathered at the top of the stairs, their earlier confidence entirely replaced by wide-eyed fear. "This is an outrage," Margaret said weakly, though there was no real strength left in her protest. "His Grace also requests," the messenger continued, unmoved by her objection, "that Miss Ellie Hartley be permitted to receive visitors this morning, as he intends to call upon her personally within the hour." At the sound of her name spoken aloud with such formal respect, something in Margaret's expression cracked entirely. She turned slowly to find Ellie standing in the kitchen doorway, and for the first time in 3 long years, Ellie saw something other than contempt in her stepmother's eyes. She saw fear. "You did this," Margaret said quietly, once the messenger and guards had departed. "You brought this upon this house." "No," Ellie said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her chest. "You brought this upon yourself, the moment you decided that cruelty was an acceptable way to treat a grieving child. I only refused to remain silent about it any longer." Margaret had no response to that. She retreated upstairs without another word, and for the first time since her father's death, the house fell into a silence that felt less like fear, and more like the quiet before something long overdue finally arrived. True to his word, Julian arrived exactly 1 hour later, though this time, he came not in the sleek black carriage of the previous night, but in a formal procession, bearing the full authority of his position, accompanied by 2 royal advisors and a small contingent of guards. Ellie had changed into her simple work dress, uncertain of what else to wear, feeling suddenly self-conscious about the contrast between the elegant gown from the night before and the plain, worn fabric she now wore. If Julian noticed the difference, he gave no indication of it. He greeted her with the same warmth he had shown throughout the previous evening, taking her hand gently as he stepped through the front door of the modest house. "I hope I haven't come too early," he said. "Not at all," Ellie replied, still adjusting to the surreal reality of the Duke of Camden, standing in her father's front hallway. "Though I should warn you, the household is not exactly prepared to receive guests of your standing." "I'm not here as a guest," Julian said, his expression turning more serious. "I'm here to see this matter resolved properly." Margaret appeared at the top of the stairs then, having clearly composed herself somewhat since the messenger's earlier visit, though the strain remained visible around her eyes. She descended slowly, offering a formal curtsy that lacked all of the confidence she had displayed the previous evening. "Your Grace," she said carefully, "I hope we might discuss this matter reasonably." "There is little left to discuss, madam," Julian said, his tone polite but firm. "My advisors have already begun reviewing the estate records you surrendered this morning. Preliminary findings suggest significant discrepancies between the fortune Edmund Hartley left behind and the funds currently accounted for within this household." Margaret's composure faltered visibly. The burrito was cold. Managing a household of this size requires considerable expense. "The discrepancies in question," one of Julian's advisors interjected, stepping forward with a leather folder in hand, "amount to considerably more than reasonable household expenses would explain, madam. We have found evidence of several transactions redirecting funds toward accounts unrelated to this household's needs, dated within months of your husband's passing." The color drained entirely from Margaret's face. Behind her, Charlotte and Beatrice had gone completely still, the weight of their mother's actions finally becoming real, in a way that no amount of denial could soften. "What happens now?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "That depends largely on the terms we agree to this morning," Julian said, I have no particular interest in prolonged legal proceedings that would drag this family's reputation through further scandal. However, I do insist that Ellie Hartley's rightful inheritance be restored immediately, along with formal acknowledgement of her position within this household as Edmund Hartley's true and legitimate daughter. Margaret's shoulders sagged with the weight of defeat, and if I agree to these terms, then the matter will be settled quietly, with the estate records corrected, and the remaining fortune redistributed according to the original terms of Edmund Hartley's will, Julian said. You and your daughters will retain a modest portion, sufficient to establish yourselves comfortably elsewhere, though you will no longer hold any claim to this household or its remaining assets. For a long moment, Margaret said nothing, clearly weighing her limited options. Finally, she nodded stiffly. I agree to your terms, Your Grace. The formal arrangements took the better part of the morning to finalize, with Julian's advisors reviewing documents and drafting the necessary paperwork, while Ellie sat quietly in the parlor, still struggling to fully comprehend the sudden and dramatic shift in her circumstances. Agnes hovered nearby throughout the process, occasionally squeezing Ellie's hand in silent support, her eyes bright with unshed tears of relief. By early afternoon, the arrangements had been finalized. Margaret, Charlotte, and Beatrice would depart within the week to a smaller property some distance away, provided with enough funds to live comfortably, but modestly, far removed from the grand household they had grown accustomed to controlling. The remainder of Edmund Hartley's fortune, along with full ownership of the family home, was formally restored to Ellie. As the royal advisors departed with the finalized documents, Julian remained behind, finding Ellie alone in the small garden behind the house, the same garden she had once tended as a child, now overgrown and neglected after years of forced labor elsewhere had left her no time for such gentle pursuits. You've been quiet all morning, Julian observed, joining her among the tangled, untended flower beds. It's a great deal to process, Ellie admitted. Yesterday morning I was standing on these front steps dressed in rags, and today I own this entire house, along with more wealth than I've seen in 3 years combined. It doesn't feel entirely real yet. It will, given time, Julian said gently. These things rarely feel real immediately, but the reality remains, regardless of how strange it feels. Ellie knelt beside one of the overgrown flower beds, running her fingers through the tangled greenery, remembering the small songs she used to sing while tending this very patch of earth so many years ago. I used to imagine my father might return one day and find some way to fix everything Margaret had broken, she said softly. I know that's foolish. He's gone, and nothing will ever change that. But some part of me kept hoping regardless. That's not foolish, Julian said, kneeling beside her. That's simply hope refusing to disappear entirely, even under the worst circumstances. I imagine that's precisely the quality that carried you through these past 3 years. Ellie looked up at him, studying his face in the afternoon sunlight, still marveling at the strange turn her life had taken within the span of a single evening. What happens now? She asked. Between us, I mean. Julian's expression grew thoughtful. That depends entirely on what you want, Ellie. I meant what I said last night, about not expecting an immediate answer. You've just regained your independence, your fortune, your rightful place in this household. I have no intention of rushing you into anything before you've had time to properly settle into this new reality. And if I don't need time? Ellie asked, surprising herself with the boldness of the question. What if I already know what I want? Julian's eyes searched hers carefully, searching for any hesitation, any lingering doubt. Finding none, something warm and hopeful spread across his features. Then I would be the happiest man in this entire kingdom to hear you say it. Ellie took a breath, steadying herself against the nervous flutter in her chest. I want this, she said softly. Not because you're a duke, not because of the title, or the fortune, or anything this arrangement might provide. I want this because for the first time in 3 years, someone looked at me and saw a person worth valuing, rather than a burden to be managed, or a servant to be commanded. That means more to me than any crown ever could. Julian reached for her hand, holding it gently between both of his own. Then let us begin properly, he said. Ellie Hartley, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Ellie felt tears gathering in her eyes, tears that carried none of the sorrow she had grown so accustomed to over the past 3 years, only overwhelming relief and joy so profound, it nearly stole the breath from her lungs entirely. Yes, she said, her voice steady, despite the emotion coursing through her. Yes, I will. The garden around them, overgrown and neglected for so long, seemed to Ellie in that moment like a fitting symbol of her own life, something that had been forgotten and left untended through years of hardship, yet still capable of blooming again, given the right care and attention. As Julian drew her into a gentle embrace, she allowed herself, for the first time in 3 long years, to fully believe that happiness was not something reserved for other people, but something she too was allowed to claim as her own. The wedding took place on a bright morning in early autumn, held not within the towering halls of the royal palace, but in the very garden Ellie had restored with her own hands over the preceding months. She had insisted on it, despite the Duchess Dowager's gentle suggestion that a ceremony of this significance belonged within grander walls, and Julian had readily agreed, understanding exactly why the choice mattered so much to her. The overgrown flower beds she had knelt beside on that first afternoon had transformed entirely under her careful attention, blooming with the same varieties of flowers her mother had once planted decades earlier, their colors bright against the crisp autumn air. Agnes stood near the front of the small gathering, dressed in the finest gown she had owned in years, tears streaming freely down her weathered face as she watched Ellie walk toward Julian, beneath an archway woven from climbing roses. The guest list remained modest by royal standards, filled mostly with the kind townspeople who had once watched Ellie stand in rags on her front steps, now witnessing an entirely different scene unfold. Peter, the young stable boy who had driven her to the ball months earlier, stood proudly near the back with his own family, having been rewarded generously for his role in that fateful evening, though Ellie insisted his kindness alone would have been reward enough. Margaret, Charlotte, and Beatrice were not present. They had relocated to a small property 2 counties away shortly after the estate settlement, and though Ellie had briefly considered extending an invitation out of some lingering sense of family obligation, Julian had gently reminded her that forgiveness did not require continued exposure to those who had caused such lasting harm. Ellie had eventually agreed, choosing instead to send a brief, formal letter wishing them well in their new circumstances, closing a chapter of her life that no longer needed to remain open. News reached them occasionally through distant acquaintances that the 3 women had struggled to adjust to their reduced circumstances, that Charlotte and Beatrice had each married modestly within the year, their earlier ambitions of noble marriages abandoned entirely once their true financial situation became widely known throughout the surrounding counties. Ellie felt no satisfaction in their diminished fortunes, only a quiet, distant relief that their capacity to harm her had finally been permanently removed. The years that followed brought changes Ellie could scarcely have imagined during those long, difficult years of servitude within her own home. She threw herself into charitable work throughout the kingdom, establishing support systems for young women left vulnerable by the loss of a parent or guardian. Determined that no one else should endure the isolation and cruelty she had experienced without any recourse or protection. Julian proved to be exactly the partner he had promised to be that first night at the ball, treating her not as a title to be managed or a duty to be fulfilled, but as a genuine equal whose opinions and experiences shaped the decisions they made together. He often credited her with helping him rediscover a warmth and purpose he had lost during his years at war, a transformation that did not go unnoticed by the Duchess Dowager, who grew to treat Ellie with a genuine affection that surprised everyone who remembered her initial skepticism at the ball. Agnes remained a permanent fixture within their household, refusing every attempt Ellie made to grant her a more comfortable retirement, insisting instead that she preferred remaining useful for as long as her health allowed. She lived to see Ellie's first child born 2 years after the wedding, a daughter with her mother's dark hair and her father's steady, thoughtful eyes, whom they named in honor of Ellie's own mother. On quiet evenings, long after the excitement of that first extraordinary ball had faded into a cherished memory rather than a recent event, Ellie would sometimes walk through the restored garden behind her childhood home, now used as a peaceful retreat whenever the demands of royal life grew overwhelming. She would think back to that terrified girl who had stood on the front steps in torn, ash-stained rags, certain that her life held nothing beyond servitude and quiet suffering, and marvel at how far that same girl had traveled since. She never forgot the lessons those difficult years had taught her, carrying forward a deep empathy for anyone struggling under circumstances beyond their control, refusing to let her newfound comfort and privilege dull the compassion those hardships had instilled within her. She often told her own children, as they grew older, that true worth had nothing to do with the clothes one wore, or the fortune one possessed, but everything to do with the character one maintained, even when no one else seemed to be watching. Julian, for his part, often remarked that meeting Ellie had taught him something equally important, that genuine connection could not be manufactured through titles or ceremonies, but only through honest moments shared between two people, willing to see each other clearly, without pretense or performance. Their marriage, built upon that foundation of authenticity, remained strong and genuine through every challenge that followed, a partnership that many within the royal court came to admire and, in their own ways, hoped to emulate. Decades later, long after the scandal of that memorable ball had faded into little more than a fondly remembered story told at family gatherings, Ellie would occasionally encounter young women within the kingdom who reminded her of herself during those darkest years, women trapped within difficult circumstances, convinced that their worth had been permanently diminished by cruelty they had not deserved. To each of them, she offered the same quiet reminder that Agnes had once given her, on the night everything had finally begun to change. No dress, no title, no cruel words spoken by someone who should have offered protection instead of harm, could ever truly take away who a person was meant to become. Circumstances could bend a person, could bruise them deeply, could make hope feel like a luxury too dangerous to risk believing in. But given the smallest opportunity, the smallest flicker of kindness offered at exactly the right moment, that same person could rise again, transformed not through magic or fortune, but through the quiet, stubborn strength that had been there all along, simply waiting for someone to finally see it clearly. And so the story of the girl once dressed in rags for a ball, whose entire life changed within a single unforgettable evening, became more than simply a tale of unexpected romance or sudden fortune. It became, for countless others who heard it in the years that followed, a reminder that even in the darkest of circumstances, dignity could never truly be stripped away, and that sometimes, the most profound transformations began not with grand magic, but with one person's simple decision, to finally believe they deserved better than what cruelty had convinced them to accept.